The sun over the Sonoran Desert was already a furnace by 2:30 in the afternoon. Heat shimmered across the sand like a living thing, swallowing color, sound, and mercy. Staff Sergeant Zoe Brooks knelt in that heat, her hands bound tight behind her back with plastic zip ties that bit into the skin. Sweat rolled from her forehead into her eyes, stinging, blurring the horizon into waves of gold and white. Around here, there was nothing but emptiness. No trees, no shadows, only the sound of a truck engine idling and the dry wind scraping across the dunes. The cartel lieutenant stood over her, boots sinking slightly in the sand. He carried an AK pattern rifle slung across his chest. The muzzle blackened from use. His voice came rough, accented, confident. "Delta Force," he said with a sneer. "Elite soldiers. But even elite need water." His men laughed, tossing a half-empty bottle onto the ground before kicking sand over it. He told her she would not last 3 hours, maybe less. The desert would do his work for him. She said nothing. She didn't give him the satisfaction. Her face stayed calm, unreadable, eyes fixed not on him, but on the angle of the sun. He grew impatient, barked something to his men, and climbed back into the truck. The sound of the engine roared, fading until only the wind remained. Dust rose, hung in the air, and then slowly settled over her boots. Silence, real silence, the kind that pressed against the ears and made the world feel like it had stopped breathing. Zoe exhaled once, slowly. Her wrists hurt, her throat was dry. The heat pressed on her shoulders like weight. She looked around, scanning the horizon. She marked the distant ridges, the faint line of mountains that could only mean east. She estimated the temperature, the direction of the wind, and how long she had until the sun dropped low enough for movement. Her heartbeat slowed. Panic was the enemy. Thinking was survival. Somewhere, deep, in her memory, training instructors' voices returned. Adapt, assess, act. Every problem has a solution. The desert stretched out like an ocean of fire, and she was a single point of life in the middle of it. They thought the heat would break her. They thought the silence would finish her. What they didn't understand was that this was exactly where her training began. The operations room in El Paso felt colder than it should have. The air conditioning hummed against the desert heat outside, and the fluorescent lights gave the space a hard, sterile glow. Maps covered one wall, a large screen at the front, displaying satellite imagery of a compound in the middle of nowhere. The image zoomed in and out as DEA agent Morrison clicked through the details. Lieutenant Colonel David Kane stood near the end of the long table, arms crossed, silent but attentive. He was in his mid-40s, with the kind of quiet authority that made men straighten up without being told. Around the table sat 7 operators, each focused in their own way. Zoe Brooks sat second from the end, her notepad open, eyes moving between the screen and the printed terrain map in front of her. Across from her, Marcus Washington leaned back in his chair, heavy shoulders tense, a ballpoint pen rolling between his fingers. Jennifer Martinez, the team medic, had a calm intensity that matched the colonel's. Morrison's voice cut through the low hum of the room. The Salazar cartel, one of their southern distribution hubs, 90 kilometers into the Sonoran Desert, moving roughly $50 million worth of fentanyl north every month, enough to kill 10 million people. He paused, letting the number hang in the air, before adding that they were holding 3 American hostages taken from a border town 4 days earlier. Kane's voice was low, direct. Why not DEA or Border Patrol? Morrison gave a tired, half smile. Because this job needs precision, no second chances. Intelligence suggests they're equipped with M240S, RPGs, and possibly a few man-portable missiles. Their defensive positions are military grade. If we send conventional forces, we lose too many people. We need Delta. The team nodded slightly. Understanding the weight of that statement, Zoe kept her eyes on the screen as Morrison switched to a topographic map. She noted the elevation of the compound, its high ground advantage, the lack of cover in the approach. When the agent mentioned the terrain, she raised her hand. "What's the water situation?" The room went quiet for a beat. Morrison blinked. "There's a well in the compound. Outside of that, typical Sonoran terrain. Dry. Hostile. No surface water." Why Zoe's tone stayed analytical? Because if their defenses rely on personnel rotation, hydration is their limiting factor. They can't push far from the compound. That means their patrols are short-range. Morrison nodded slowly, impressed. While Washington gave her a curious look, the question shifted the energy in the room. Kane watched her for a moment, reading the thought behind her calm expression. She was already fighting the environment in her mind. By the time Morrison ended the briefing, with timelines and insertion details, Zoe wasn't thinking about the enemy. She was thinking about heat, about distance, about how, in that desert, the real fight wouldn't be with the cartel. It would be with the land itself. The MH-60M Black Hawk flew low over the Sonoran Desert, its rotor wash scattering sand in ghostly spirals below. Inside the cabin, the operators sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces hidden behind night vision goggles, weapons locked against their chests. The thump of the rotors was steady, almost hypnotic. Blending with the hum of the aircraft systems, no one spoke. There was nothing to say. They had rehearsed this insertion a dozen times, each man and woman knowing their role down to the second. Lieutenant Colonel David Kane gave a quick glance to his watch. 0200 hours. He nodded once to the crew chief. 2 minutes. The pilot's voice came calm and clipped over the intercom, confirming altitude and approach vector. Below them, the desert stretched in shades of black and gray, broken only by faint ridgelines and the occasional flash of reflected starlight. The target compound was 15 kilometers east. The helicopter slowed, hovered briefly over a flat stretch of terrain, and the team moved. 8 operators dropped into the darkness in practiced rhythm. Weapons up. Scanning sectors. The MH-60 lifted away within seconds, vanishing into the horizon like it had never been there. On the ground, they adjusted quickly. Zoe Brooks took point with her M4A1, scanning through her ACOG optic. The faint green tint of her NVGs painting the desert in eerie hues. Washington brought up the rear, carrying the heavier M249. The team moved in wedge formation, maintaining spacing of 10 meters. Only the soft crunch of boots in sand and the low click of gear straps broke the silence. Every 30 minutes, they halted, checked bearings on their 4Trex GPS units, and adjusted course. The heat, even at night, clung to their uniforms. Washington muttered over the radio, half amused, half annoyed. "Feels like walking in an oven," Zoe replied, dry and quiet. "Welcome to Sonora." By 4:45 in the morning, they reached their observation point, a rocky outcrop overlooking the compound. Zoe settled into overwatch, prone behind her rifle, scanning through her optic. The facility below glowed faintly with generator lights, guard posts marked by the dull movement of silhouettes. For a few minutes, everything was exactly as planned. Then, motion flickered in her peripheral view. She shifted her scope, saw a cartel patrol moving toward them from a shallow gully, one never marked on the satellite imagery. 3 vehicles, armed men walking beside them. She whispered a warning into comms. "Contact. North Gully. Too late." Headlights cut through the dark, sweeping their position. Gunfire erupted. The night exploded in flashes of light and sound. The team returned fire in short, controlled bursts. But the advantage was gone. The element of surprise vanished in seconds. Kane's voice was steady on comms, ordering a fallback. The desert echoed with gunfire. tracer rounds slicing through the night as the team began to move. The mission had just gone sideways. Gunfire cracked across the open desert, the sound sharp and metallic against the still night. Dust lifted in choking waves as rounds struck the ground around the Delta team. Muzzle flashes strobed through the darkness. Lighting faces, weapons, and sand. Zoe Brooks lay behind a shallow rise, her M4A1 pressed against her shoulder, firing short, disciplined bursts. Each shot counted. Each magazine changed smooth and practiced. Over the radio, Sergeant First Class Jennifer Martinez's voice came through, tight and urgent. "They're flanking us on the right." Kane's response was steady, his tone calm despite the chaos. "Shift fire sectors. Washington. Lay down suppressive fire. Move on my mark." Zoe glanced left, scanning through her optic. The cartel fighters were spreading wide. Using the terrain's folds to encircle them, she tracked muzzle flashes. Estimated distance. Direction. Numbers. It was a textbook pincer. Kane's voice again, clipped and focused, ordering fallback intervals. But she could see what he couldn't yet. The enemy was already adjusting. If they tried to pull back now, they'd be cut off within minutes. She exhaled slowly, her mind keyed. She knew what had to happen. No hesitation, no drama, just math. She toggled her radio, breaking north, drawing fire. Negative. Kane snapped. Hold position. She ignored him, already on her feet, firing controlled bursts as she moved. Her shots sparked along the ridge, forcing the cartel to reorient. Washington shouted something, but his voice was swallowed by gunfire. Kane came back on comms. Lower this time. "Brooks, that's an order." She didn't answer. Orders didn't matter if no one survived to follow them. She sprinted across the open ground, every muscle burning. Heat trapped under her gear. Bullets whipped past, cutting through the air like insects. She dove behind a jagged rock outcrop, firing again, keeping their focus fixed on her. In the distance, she heard Kane's voice calling retreat coordinates. The rest of the team began to move. The firefight stretched, then thinned, then faded as the others disappeared into the desert. Zoe reloaded, checked her bearings, and kept moving north, her breath steady in the cooling air. Behind her, the echoes of gunfire faded into silence. The desert swallowed the sound, leaving only wind and darkness. For the first time, she was alone. The desert was silent again when the gunfire stopped. Hours later, the cartel truck bounced across the sand, its tires grinding over loose gravel as the engine growled against the heat. Zoe Brooks sat in the back, wrists sip-teed. Blood crusted along her sleeve where shrapnel had grazed her arm. The men guarding her laughed, their words blending into the wind. The air smelled of fuel and dust. When the truck slowed, she lifted her head, eyes squinting through the glare. The lieutenant was waiting outside. His shirt was unbuttoned, a pistol on his hip, his face slick with sweat. He gestured for the others to drag her out. She stumbled as her boots hit the ground, the heat from the sand burning through the soles. The sky was a hard white, the kind that erased shadows and mercy. The lieutenant crouched beside her. His accent was thick, his tone smug. "Delta Force," he said, pretending to be impressed. "Elite soldiers." "Yes, but even elite need water." He nodded to his men, who tossed her rucksack onto the sand, then laughed as they climbed back into the truck. He stepped close, his shadow short under the sun. "Let's see how long you last. Maybe 3 hours, maybe less." Then he spit into the dust near her boots and turned away. The truck roared to life, wheels spinning. The sound grew smaller until it disappeared completely, swallowed by the wind. Zoe stayed still for a long moment, her head bowed, the sun pressing against her neck. Her breathing was slow, controlled. She looked around, letting her eyes adjust. The horizon stretched forever, broken only by distant ridgelines to the east. The heat shimmered in waves. She guessed it was around 2 o'clock. The light said as much. She noted wind direction, terrain slope, and where the sun would drop in a few hours. Her wrists burned under the plastic restraints, but her pulse stayed steady. Panic wasted oxygen. Thought kept you alive. She raised her head finally, eyes narrowing toward the distant mountains. The desert wasn't her grave. It was her next battlefield, and it didn't know her yet. Zoe waited until the truck's dust faded into the heat shimmer. Then she began to move. Her wrists burned where the plastic bit into the skin. Bu, pain, mon circulation. Pain meant she was alive. She rotated her hands, testing the flex of the tie. The give in the plastic. Heavy duty. Factory standard restraints. Not military grade, but close enough. She'd seen worse during SERE training. She remembered the instructor's voice from years ago in North Carolina. You can't fight plastic. You work against it. She took a slow breath, then dislocated her left thumb with a practice twist. The pain was sharp, white-hot, but controlled. She slipped her smaller hand through the loop, the plastic grinding against raw skin, and freed her right hand. With another steady movement, she popped her thumb back into place. A grunt escaped her throat, but her breathing stayed even. Hands free. Step 1, complete. The sun pressed down like a physical force. She could feel her pulse in her temples. Heat management came first. She needed to lower her body temperature before dehydration set in. She scanned the terrain, eyes landing on a creosote bush about 10 yards away. It was small, leaf dusty, but its roots were deep. That meant cooler sand below. She dug with her hands, carving a shallow pit, about 2 feet deep. The sand beneath was cool to the touch. She stripped off her uniform blouse, buried it in the damp sand for several minutes, then pulled it out and put it back on. The fabric clung to her skin, evaporating moisture slowly. It dropped her surface temperature just enough to stop the headache forming behind her eyes. She sat in the shadow of the bush for a minute, measuring her breathing. Delta had drilled it into her control. Your breathing. Control your panic. Her watch was gone, but the sun's angle told her it was around 3 o'clock. 5 hours to sunset. Next. Water. The Sonoran Desert looked dead. But it wasn't. Every living thing here survived on something. She rose and scanned the horizon, her eyes narrowing against the glare. No visible surface water. But she knew what to look for. Birds flying low toward the same point. Insect activity concentrated near shaded rock. Animal tracks that converged instead of spreading apart. She started walking southeast. Steady pace. Conserving energy. After an hour, she found faint tracks. Coyote. Rabbit. And something heavier. Maybe javelina. They all pointed the same way. She followed. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw. But she moved with purpose. The trail led to a shallow ravine. The air felt slightly cooler there. She crouched low, tracing her fingers along the stone until she felt dampness. A seep spring. Tiny. Barely a trickle. She used her uniform shirt as a filter, soaking it slowly and squeezing water into her mouth, letting it absorb gradually. Delta training had taught her that too much. Too fast. Killed as surely as thirst. She drank only what she needed. Then filled a small, improvised pouch made from the shirt's sleeve. The water tasted like earth and metal. But it was life. As the light softened, she turned to tools. A dead saguaro cactus nearby offered material. She snapped off dry ribs. Straight and light. Perfect for stakes or digging. She gathered creosote resin from broken branches and warmed it in her hand until it turned sticky. It would work as antiseptic or glue. From a flat piece of rock, She napped a sharp edge. Primitive tools. But enough to work. Enough to survive. The sun dipped behind the mountains, shadows stretching long. The temperature dropped fast. From blistering heat to dry chill, Zoe stood on a rise, scanning east. She could just make out the faint lights of the compound on the horizon, maybe 70 kilometers away. She mapped the route in her head. Dividing the distance into 3 nights' travel, she found Polaris in the sky, fixed her bearings, and adjusted her pace plan accordingly. Night would be her ally now. She took one last look around the empty desert. The silence was immense, but no longer threatening. She'd broken it down, analyzed it, turned it into something she could use. The desert wasn't her enemy anymore. It was her training ground. She pulled the damp shirt tighter against her skin, adjusted hair, makeshift gear, and began walking east under the stars. Each step was deliberate. Each breath measured. Her body hurt, but her mind was sharp. Somewhere in the dark, the cartel believed she was already dead. Let them. She walked on, calm, certain, whispering to herself that the desert wasn't trying to kill her. It was teaching her how to live. The desert at night was unrecognizable. The same place that had tried to burn Zoe Brooks alive by day now stretched out beneath her boots in cool silence. Lit by starlight, sharp enough to cast shadows. The air was thin and dry, carrying the faint hum of insects and the distant cry of a coyote. Her steps made almost no sound, just the soft scrape of gravel and sand. She moved steadily, each stride measured, conserving energy. Every 20 minutes she paused, adjusted her direction by the stars. Polaris anchored her north. The summer triangle gave her east. Her mind tracked time by instinct. When the air began to cool sharply, she knew it was close to 3 in the morning. That first night, she covered nearly 40 kilometers. The terrain undulated gently, deceptive in the darkness. She used natural contours for concealment, always moving through shadow, never along ridge lines. Once, she spotted headlights several kilometers away. The cartel, maybe searching for her body. She dropped to the ground, pressed against the sand, and watched their dust trails fade before moving again. The temperature dropped fast after midnight, and by dawn, the desert was cold enough that her breath hung faintly in front of her. She found shelter under a shallow rock ledge, dug into the sand for insulation, and rested. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the occasional buzz of insects or the faint rattle of a snake moving somewhere nearby. By the second night, fatigue had settled deep into her muscles. Her lips were cracked, her eyes dry from the wind. The blister on her right heel had split open hours ago. Pain was irrelevant. She managed it the same way she had during Delta selection, 1 kilometer at a time. That night she found a small seep again, marked by animal tracks clustered under an eroded rock face. She drank carefully, refilled her makeshift pooch, and pushed on. The stars above were steady companions, fixed and reliable, something her mind could trust. The third night came with wind, dry and relentless. Her pace slowed, but her focus sharpened. Around midnight, she saw something faint on the horizon, a glow where the black sky met the desert floor. It wasn't dawn. It was artificial light. The compound, her heart rate lifted. Not from emotion, but calculation. Distance, maybe 20 kilometers. If she kept a steady pace, she could reach the outer ridges before first light. By the time the stars began to fade, she climbed onto a low rise. The compound lay below, a cluster of buildings lit by spotlights and generator floodlights, surrounded by vehicles and watchtowers. She crouched, studying it through the faint haze of early dawn. Her face was burned, her uniform torn, her body near its limit, but her eyes were sharp. She whispered once, low and steady, not to herself, but to the desert that had tested her. It hadn't beaten her. It had prepared her. And now, She was ready to finish what she started. Zoe Brooks lay prone in the rocks, overlooking the cartel compound. Her cheek pressed against the stock of her rifle. Through the optic, she studied the facility with a professional's patience. The perimeter lights cut harsh circles into the sand. Guard towers rotated on predictable intervals. She counted patrols, noted timing, direction, gaps in coverage. The generator sat near the main building, its low hum audible, even from her position. Pipes ran from it toward the well, the source that fed the compound. Water, she thought. Every operation here depended on it. Without that, their numbers, weapons, and vehicles meant nothing. She shifted slightly, adjusting her scope. Her breathing stayed even, her heart rate low, despite the dehydration that had turned her lips dry and cracked. She tracked a guard walking the south fence. His rotation was every 20 minutes. That meant she had a 4-minute window when both he and the north tower would be facing away. She timed the pattern twice more to confirm. Then began her approach. She moved low, silent, using terrain depressions as cover. The sand muffled her steps. She paused behind a boulder as headlights swept the distance, waited for them to fade, then moved again. At the well, she crouched near the pump housing, listening. The rhythmic vibration of machinery told her it was drawing at full capacity. She pulled from her makeshift pouch a small bundle of creosote resin and crushed jimsonweed pods she had gathered hours earlier. In training, instructors had taught her that every environment could sustain or disable you depending on knowledge. Creosote was antiseptic in small doses, toxic in concentrated ones. Jimsonweed caused nausea, hallucination, dehydration. Together, they would incapacitate anyone drinking from this source for 24 hours without permanent harm. She packed the mixture into the intake pipe, sealed it with mud and resin to ensure dispersion, then backed away, retracing her path. She left no tracks the human eye could easily catch. By dawn, the desert was silver and gold. She returned to her vantage point, watching through the optic. At first, nothing. Then movement changed. A guard doubled over near the truck bay. Another stumbled along the wall. Within an hour, the compound shifted from order to confusion. Radios crackled with panic. Men ran between buildings, clutching stomachs. The lieutenant shouted orders that no one could follow. Zoe waited until noon. The heat shimmered across the compound as chaos spread. Then she moved in. No rush, no noisy, every step measured. She cleared corners with the precision of habit, slicing the pie, checking angles, moving like a ghost through rooms that stank of sweat and sickness. She reached the back building, the one she had marked earlier as holding the hostages. Inside, she found them: Kane, Washington, and Martinez, bound but alive. Washington's eyes widened first. Martinez covered her mouth. Kane stared at her, silent, trying to understand what he was seeing. She was sunburned, uniform torn, face streaked with dust. He finally asked, "How are you alive?" Zoe cut the ties binding his wrists with a shard of flint she had shaped days earlier. "Delta doesn't just train you to fight, SERE," she said evenly. "It trains you to adapt. The desert isn't a weapon until you learn how to use it." She handed him a confiscated rifle and glanced toward the door. Time to move. The mission wasn't over, but for the first time in 4 days, the advantage was hers. Dawn broke over the desert like a slow exhale. The compound behind them was silent now, crippled and confused, its guards too sick to fight or chase. Zoe Brooks guided her team through the chaos, every step precise. Kane moved first, rifle in hand, scanning the perimeter. Washington hot-wired a battered pickup truck near the motor pool, its engine coughing before catching. Martinez climbed into the back with Zoe, her face pale but determined. No one spoke as they drove out, the truck bouncing hard over dry ground. The rising sun painted the sand in gold and red, the colors too beautiful for the exhaustion in their bones. The wind tore through the open windows. Zoe rested her head against the frame, eyes half closed, feeling the heat return with daylight. Her hands were raw, her lips cracked, her body running on discipline alone. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, but it no longer felt hostile. Survival wasn't victory. It was continuation. Every decision she made, every calculation, had been one breath at a time. That was all survival ever was. She looked at the faces around her, tired, scarred, silent, and knew each one had fought the same battle. When they crossed into U.S. territory, hours later, the moment passed without words. The convoy that met them outside El Paso moved quickly, medics checking vitals, analysts already asking questions. Days later at Fort Bragg, those questions multiplied. How had she crossed 90 kilometers without gear? How had she incapacitated an entire compound without firing a shot? Zoe answered simply. Adapt. Survive. Complete the mission. They wrote it down like doctrine. She said it like memory. Weeks later, the ceremony was small. The Distinguished Service Cross gleamed under stage lights, but she barely looked at it. Kane stood beside her afterward, keyed as ever. You changed how we teach survival, he said. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried more fatigue than pride. Delta doesn't create heroes. SERE. It creates people who don't quit. He nodded, eyes on the horizon beyond the parade field. For a long moment, neither said anything. The wind moved across the grass, steady and familiar, carrying the scent of dust and distance. For Zoe, that was enough. The Australian outback was an ocean of red dust and shimmering heat. The air vibrated with warmth, carrying the scent of dry earth and eucalyptus. In the middle of that vastness stood a group of special operators from 3 nations, Delta Force, the Australian SASR, and Canada's JTF-2. Their faces were streaked with dirt and fatigue, their canteens half empty. They stood in silence, listening to Zoe Brooks. She wore a plain field uniform, sleeves rolled, hat pulled low against the sun. Her voice was steady, quiet, but it carried. The desert isn't your enemy, she told them. It's neutral. It doesn't care whether you live or die. What matters is how well you understand it. Every environment, no matter how harsh, has something to give you if you learn to read it. She knelt in the sand, drawing simple lines with a stick wind direction. Shade angles, water movement. Every resource you need is here, she said. You just have to know where to look and what to trust. A young operator from SERE raised his hand. How much of survival is physical versus mental? Zoe looked at him for a moment, then shook her head. Wrong question, she said. Survival isn't about strength or mindset alone. It's about knowledge applied systematically. Your body carries out the plan, but your mind builds it. The environment only wins if you stop thinking. Her tone was calm, not proud, just factual. When the class ended, the operators dispersed toward their camp, their boots leaving shallow prints in the sand. Lieutenant Colonel Kane approached from behind, hands in his pockets. He had new lines on his face, the kind that came from too many missions and too little rest. You've changed how we teach survival, he said quietly, not just in Delta, but everywhere. She nodded once. Knowledge keeps soldiers alive. SERE. That's all it ever was. They stood together for a moment as the sun dropped toward the horizon, turning the outback gold. The desert stretched endless before them, familiar yet different. Zoe watched the fading light and thought of the Sonoran nights, the silence, the heat, and the lesson that had carried her through it all. The environment doesn't decide who survives, the human mind does. Then she turned and walked back toward camp, the dust rising softly at her heels.